Marker. So, welcome everybody to Conjure Wife. We're going to be doing chapter 6 today. You can find the previous chapters on my YouTube channel, which is probably where you're listening to this in the future. Conjure Wife was originally published in 1943 and is in public domain now. It's available on Project Gutenberg, along with many other stories by Fritz Leiber, and I do recommend them. He's got a different kind of style that, not everybody is familiar with. Go out, learn something new. Also read some more recent stuff too, because, a story that's 80 years old is dated. Content warnings. I don't have a specific content warning to give you, but this is a horror story. So if horror stories are not your thing, please do bear that in mind. So far, I think the story has been kind of tame as far as that stuff goes, but this is on the realm of psychological kind of horror, I think. So, take care accordingly. And without further ado, chapter 6. And henceforth his soul is believed to be knit up in a manner with the stone. If it breaks, it is an evil omen for him. They say that thunder has struck the stone, and that he who owns it will soon die. No use. His eyes kept wandering over the mass of print. He laid the golden bough aside and leaned back. From somewhere to the east, the thunder still throbbed faintly, but the familiar leather of the easy chair imparted a sense of security and detachment. Suppose, just as an intellectual exercise, he tried to analyze it in terms of sorcery. The dragon would be a clear case of sympathetic magic. Mrs. Gunnison animated it by operating on the photographs. And if you hypothesized a bull roarer, or the recording of one, it would provide a neat magical explanation for the wind last night, and the storm and wind today, both associated with Mrs. Sawtell, and then the similar sound in his dreams. He wrinkled his nose in distaste. He could hear Tansy calling Totem from the back porch, rattling his little tin pan. But today's self-injurious acts in another category. Put today's self-injurious acts in another category. The obsidian knife, the razor blade, the cranky saucepan, the carpet tack, the match that he had let burn his fingers a few minutes ago. Perhaps the razor blade had been charmed, like the enchanted sword or axe which wounds the person who wields it. Perhaps someone had stolen the blood-smeared obsidian knife and dropped it in water, so the wound would keep flowing. That was a well-established superstition. A dog was trotting along the sidewalk out in front. He could distinctly hear the clop-clop of paws. Tansy was still calling Totem. Perhaps the sorcerer had commanded him to destroy himself by inches, or millimeters, considering the razor blade. That would explain all the self-injurious acts at one swoop. The flat voice in the dream had ordered him to do it. The dog had turned up the drive. His claws made a grating sound on the concrete. The tarot card diagrams, scribbled by Mrs. Sawtell, would figure as some magical control mechanism. The stick figure of the man in the truck had grim implications if interpreted in the light of his irrational fear of automobile accidents. It really didn't sound so much like a dog. Probably the neighbor's boy dragging home by jerks some indeterminate bulky object. The neighbor's boy devoted all his spare time to collecting old metal. "Totem! Totem!" followed by the sound of the back door closing. Finally, that very trite sense of a presence just behind him. Taller than himself, hands poised to grab. Only whenever you looked over your shoulder, it dodged. Something like that had figured in the dream. The source, perhaps, of the flat voice. And in that case, his patience snapped. An intellectual exercise, all right, for morons. He stubbed out his cigarette. "Well, I've done my duty. That cat can sing for his supper." Tansy sat on the arm of the chair and put her hand on Norman's shoulder. "How are things going at college?" He smiled up at her. He had been afraid of that question. "Not so good," he replied lightly. "The chairmanship?" He nodded. Sawtell got it. Tansy cursed fluently. It did him good to hear her. Make you want to take up conjuring again? Hold on, he shouldn't have said that. She looked at him closely. How do you mean that? She asked. Just a joke. Are you sure? I know you've been worrying about me these last few days ever since you found out, wondering if I were going totally neurotic on you and watching for the next symptom. Now, dear, you don't have to deny it. It was the natural thing. I expected you'd be suspicious of me for a while. With your knowledge of psychiatry, it would be impossible for you to believe that anyone could shake off an obsession so quickly. And I've been so happy to get free from all that your suspicions haven't bothered me. I've known that they would wear off. But, darling, I honestly haven't been suspicious, he protested. Maybe I ought to have been, but I haven't. Her gray-green eyes were enigmatic and serious. She said slowly, Then what are you worrying about? Nothing at all. Here was where he had to be very careful. She shook her head. That's not true. You are worrying. Oh, I know there are some things on your mind that you haven't told me about. It isn't that. He looked up quickly. She nodded. About the chairmanship, and that some student has been threatening you, and about that Van Nys girl. She smiled briefly as he started to protest. Oh, I know you aren't the type who seduces love-struck and innocent mimeograph operators. She became serious again. Those are all minor matters, things you can take in your stride. You didn't tell me about them because you were afraid I might backslide from the desire to protect you, isn't that right? Yes. But I had the feeling that what you're worrying about goes much deeper than that. Yesterday and today, I've even felt that you wanted to turn to me for help, and somehow didn't dare. He paused, as if thinking exactly how to phrase his answer. But he was studying her face, trying to read the exact meaning of each little familiar quirk of expression around the mouth and eyes. She looked very contained, but that was only a mask, he thought. Actually, in spite of everything she said, she must still be poised close to the brink of her obsession. One little push, such as a few careless words on his part. How the devil had he ever let himself get so enmeshed in his own worries and those ridiculous projections of his own cranky imagination? Here was the only thing that mattered, the mind behind this smooth brown forehead and these clear gray-green eyes to steer that mind away from any such ridiculous notions as those he had been indulging in the last few days. To tell the truth, he said, I have been worried about you. I thought it would hurt your self-confidence if I let you know. Maybe I was unwise. You seem to have sensed it anyway, but that's what I thought. The way you feel now, of course, it can't possibly hurt you to know. It occurred to him that it was easier to lie convincingly when you love someone, provided the lie were for that person's sake. She did not give in at once. Are you sure? She said. I still have the feeling there's more to it. Suddenly she smiled and yielded to the pressure of his arm. It must be the MacKnight in me, my Scotch ancestry, she said, laughing. Awfully stubborn, you know. Monomaniacs. When we're crazy on a thing, we're completely crazy, but when we drop it all at once. Like my great-uncle Peter, you know, the one who left the Presbyterian ministry and gave up Christianity on the very same day he proved to his satisfaction there was no God. He was 72 at the time. There was a long and grumbling roll of thunder. The storm was swinging back. Well, I'm very glad you're only worried about me, she continued. It's complimentary, and I like it. She was smiling happily, but there was still something enigmatic about the eyes, something withheld. As he was congratulating himself on carrying it off successfully, it suddenly occurred to him that two could play at the game of lying. She might be holding something back herself with the idea of reassuring him. She might be trying to protect him from her own blacker worries. Her subtlety might undercut his own. No sane reason to suspect that, and yet... Suppose I get us a drink, she said, and we decide whether or not you leave Hempnell this year and look for greener fields. He nodded. She started around the bend in the L-shaped room for the sideboard. And yet you could live with a person and love a person for 15 years and not know what was behind their eyes. There was the rattle of glassware and the friendly sound of a full bottle set down on a table. Then, time to the thunder, but much, much closer, a shuddering animal scream of anguished fear. It was cut off before Norman had sprung to his feet. As he cleared the angle of the room, he saw Tansy going through the kitchen door. She was a little ahead of him down the back steps. Light fanned out from the windows of the opposite house into the service yard. It revealed the sprawled body of Totem, head mashed flat against the concrete. They heard a little sound start and stop in Tansy's throat. It might have been a gasp, or a sob, or a snarl. The light revealed a little more than the body. He moved so that his feet covered the two prominent scuffs in the concrete just beyond the body. They might have been caused by the impact of a brick or heavy stone, perhaps the thing that had killed Totem. But there was something so suggestive about their relative position that he did not want Tansy's imagination to have a chance to work on them. She lifted her face. She was never one to show much emotion. "You'd better go in," he said. "You'll—" He nodded. "Yes." She stopped halfway up the stairs. "That was a rotten, rotten thing for anyone to do." "Yes, we'll try to find out who." She left the door open. A moment later she came out and laid on the porch railing a square of heavy cloth covered with shed hair. Then she went in again and shut the door. He rolled up the cat's body and stopped at the garage for the spade. He did not spend time searching for any brick or heavy stone or other missile, nor did he examine closer the heavy footmarks he fancied he saw in the grass beyond the service yard. Lightning began to flicker as his spade bit into the soft ground by the back fence. He kept his mind strictly on the task at hand. He worked steadily, but without undue haste. When he patted down the last spadeful of earth and started for the house, the lightning flashes were stronger, making the moments in between even darker. A wind had started up and was dragging at the leaves. He did not hurry. What if the lightning did indistinctly show him a large dog near the house toward the front? There were several large dogs in the neighborhood. They were not savage. Totem had not been killed by a dog. Deliberately, he replaced the spade in the garage and walked back to the house. Only when he got inside and looked back through the screen did his thoughts break loose for a moment. The lightning flash, brightest yet, showed the dog coming around the corner of the house. He had only a glimpse, a gray dog who walked stiff-legged. He quickly closed the door and shot home the bolt. Then he remembered that the study windows were open. He must close them quickly. It might rain in. When Norman entered the living room, his face was composed. Tansy was sitting in the straight chair, leaning a little forward, an intent, moody expression around her eyes. Her hands were playing absently with a bit of twine. He carefully lit a cigarette. "You want that drink now?" he asked, not too casually, not too sharply. "No, thanks. You have one." Her hands kept on knotting and unknotting the twine. He sat down and picked up his book. From the easy chair he could watch her unobtrusively. And now that he had no grave to dig or other mechanical tasks to perform, his thoughts were not to be denied. But at least he could keep them circling in a little isolated sphere inside his skull without affecting either the expression of his face or the direction of his other thoughts, which were protectively focused on Tansy. "Sorcery is," went the thoughts inside the sphere. "Something has been conjured down from a roof. Women are witches fighting for their men. Tansy was a witch. She was guarding you, but you made her stop." "In that case," he replied swiftly to the thoughts inside the sphere, "why isn't Tansy aware of what's happening? It can't be denied that she has acted very relieved and happy." "Are you sure she isn't aware or becoming aware?" answered the thoughts inside the sphere. "Besides, in losing her weapons, she has lost her sensitivity, which had probably declined in acuteness through familiarity. Without microscope or telescope, a scientist would be no better able to tell than a savage to see the germs of typhoid or the moons of Mars. His natural sensory equipment would even be inferior to that of the savage." And the imprisoned thoughts buzzed violently, like bees seeking escape from a stopped-up hive. "Norman," Tansy said abruptly, without looking up at him, "you found and burned that hand in your watch charm, didn't you?" He thought a moment. "Yes, I did," he said lightly. "I'd really forgotten about it. There were so many." He turned a page and then another. Thunder crackled loudly and rain began to patter on the roof. Norman, you burned the diary too, didn't you? You were right in doing it, of course. I held it back because it didn't contain actual curses, only the formulas for them. So in a twisted, illogical way, I pretended it didn't count. That was harder to answer. He felt as if he were playing a guessing game and Tansy was getting perilously warm. The thoughts in the sphere buzzed triumphantly. Mrs. Gunnison has the diary. Now she knows all of Tansy's protective charms. But he answered, Yes, I did burn it. I'm sorry, but I thought... Of course, Tansy cut in. You were quite right. Her fingers played more rapidly with the cord. She did not look down at it. Lightning showed flashes of pale street and trees through the window. The patter of rain grew in volume, but through it he fancied he heard the scrunch of paws on the drive. Ridiculous. Rain and wind were making too much noise. His eyes were attracted to the pattern of knots Tansy's restless fingers were weaving. They were complicated, strong-looking knots which fell apart at a single cutting jerk, reminding him of how Tansy had studied assiduously the cat's cradles of the Indians. It also recalled to his mind how knots are used by the primitives to tie and loose the winds, to hold loved ones, to noose far-off enemies, to inhibit or free all manner of physical and physiological processes, and how the fates weave destinies like threads. He found something very pleasing in the pattern of the knots and the rhythmic movements which produced them. They seemed to signify security, until they fell apart. Norman, the voice was preoccupied and rapid. What was that snapshot you asked Hulda Gunnison to show you last night? He felt a brief flurry of panic. She was getting very warm. This was the stage of the game where you cried out, hot! And then he heard the heavy, unyielding clump on the boards of the front porch, seeming to move questingly along the wall. The sphere of alien thoughts began to exert an irresistible centrifugal pressure. He felt his sanity being smothered between the assaults from without and within. Very deliberately, he shaved off the ash of his cigarette against the edge of the tray. It was of the roof of Estrie, he said casually. Gunnison told me she'd taken a number of pictures of that sort, and I wanted to see a sample. Some sort of creature in it, wasn't there? Knots flickered into being and vanished with bewildering speed. It seemed to him suddenly that more than twine was being manipulated, and more than empty air tied and loosed, as if the knots were somehow creating an influence, as an electric current along a twisted wire creates a complex magnetic field. No, he said, and then made himself chuckle. Unless you count in a stray gargoyle or two. Thunder ripped and crashed deafeningly. Lightning might have struck in the neighborhood. Tansy did not move a muscle in response. That was a Lulu, he started to say. Then, as the thunder crash trailed off in rumblings, and there was a second's lull in the rain, he heard the sound of something leaping heavily down from the front edge of the porch toward that part of the wall where the large low window was set. He got to his feet and walked toward the window, as if to look out at the storm. As he passed Tansy's chair, he saw that her rippling fingers were creating a strange knot resembling a flower, with 7 loops for petals. She stared like a sleepwalker. Then he was at the window, shielding her. The next lightning flash showed him what he knew he must see. It crouched, facing the window. The head was still blank and crude as an unfinished skull. In the ensuing surge of blackness, a sphere of alien thoughts expanded with instant swiftness until it occupied his entire mind. He glanced behind him. Tansy's hands were still. The strange 7-looped knot was poised between them. Just as he was turning back, he saw the hands jerk apart and the loops whip in like a 7-fold snare and hold. And in that same moment of turning, he saw the street brighten like day, and a great ribbon of lightning split the tall elm opposite and fork into several streams, which streaked across the street toward the window, and the stony form upreared against it. Then, blinding light and a tingling electrical surge through his whole body. But in his mind's eye was indelibly traced the incandescent track of the lightning, whose multiple streams, racing toward the upreared stony form, had converged upon it as if drawn together by a 7-fold knot. The sphere of alien thoughts expanded beyond his skull at a dizzy rate, vanished. His gasping, uncontrollable laughter rose above the dying reverberations of the Titan thunderblast. He dragged open the window, pulled a bridge lamp up to it, jerked the cover from the lamp so its light flooded outward. "Look, Tansy," he called, his words mixed with the manic laughter. "Look what those crazy students have done." She must be made to think it was a joke. "Those frat men, I bet. I kidded in class. Look what they dragged down from campus and stuck in our front yard. Of all the crazy things, we'll have to call Building and Grounds to take it away tomorrow." Rain splattered in his face. There was a sulphurous metallic odor. Her hand touched his shoulder. She stared out blankly, her eyes still asleep. It stood there propped against the wall, solid and inert as only the inorganic can be. In some places the cement was darkened and fused. And of all mad coincidences, he gasped, the lightning had to go and strike it. On an impulse, he reached out his hand and touched it. At the feel of the rough, unyielding surface, still hot from the lightning flash, his laughter died and a grim lucidity flooded his mind. "Eppur si muove," he murmured to himself, so low that even Tansy, standing beside him, might not have heard. "Eppur si muove."